I'm Sherry Sayer, and I'm a past president and the current treasurer of the Women's Centric Club. We also have Deborah Alderman, who is hopefully up there in the top, who's our vice president, and she's our technical person. Our secretary is Cindy Hughes, and our past president is Tammy Peterson, and they're both on the board, and they're here for the program today. And we have several other members of the club who are with us, as well as many, many guests today. So those slides that I hope you were able to see gave you some of the background on the Women's Centric Club. We are now in our 130th year of operation, one of the older clubs in Seattle, I reckon. And if you have any questions about the club or anything else you'd like to put in the chat box, especially questions as Larry is doing his talk, go ahead and put those in the chat box, which may be at the bottom of your screen. We're never quite sure where yours is. This is one of our usual third Friday meetings that we would typically hold at the Dearborn House, but our last one was in February 2020 there. And that's also the home of Historic Seattle on First Hill. But we have been doing virtual programs for quite a while now. And Deborah, I'm going to introduce Larry. So you've already got his slides up there. So Larry Kreisman. So many of you and all of us know Larry through his role as the program director of Historic Seattle for 20 years. He retired from that position in 2017. Previous to that, he was director of Seattle Architecture Foundation's tour program for 13 years. He has been recognized for some significant work in bringing public attention to the Northwest's architectural heritage and preservation through courses, tours, lectures, exhibitions, articles, and 11 books. Larry was also instrumental in introducing many of the Historic Seattle members to the Women's Century Club. He had a meeting, a program meeting there in 2015 when we were still meeting at the Harvard Exit Theater, which was our original clubhouse, and several of us joined based on that meeting. I also know Larry in his current role as coordinator of the Seattle Arts and Crafts Guild, which is another excellent group in Seattle. And it started as a subgroup of Historic Seattle. So during 2020 and continuing into this year, Larry has become a popular speaker on the virtual circuit with his programs on stained glass, historic theaters, and collecting 1900 modern. I've seen all three of those and they're excellent, and he has others. So this is one that was done in 2016, he said, the last one, and so I selected it. I have seen this one before too in person, and it's really good. So we will all enjoy it. Again, questions, comments, keep stuff going in the chat, and we'll have time for a Q&A after the talk. We typically end at 3:30, but if people want to keep asking questions or chatting, we can keep it open for a while. So thank you for being here, Larry, and I'm going to turn slide deck over to you. Actually, Deborah's going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for the publicity. I may be needing a publicist at some point, right? And,
yeah.
Okay, so Larry, I just need to make you a co-host. Hang on. Oh, I got all these people coming in. Let me just make you a co-host. Give me 1 second. Oh, a lot of people here. Okay, Larry, you should be able to share your screen now. And folks who are joining us, we've just introduced our guest speaker, and he's just about ready to get started. If you can stop sharing your video and make sure you're muted, we'd really appreciate it. And then after he's done with his presentation, we can let you participate in the question and answer period, and we'll try to save a little time for that. Meanwhile, if you want to be putting your questions in the chat, I'll be monitoring that. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me. It's always a pleasure to talk to a group, and even a virtual group. I still miss the opportunity to talk to a live audience, especially when I crack a joke and there's no laughter. So laugh as you will. I did do this originally in 2016, and it was entitled Gardens of Eden, Seattle, the City Beautiful. And as we go through, I think you'll get an understanding of why I did that. How could anyone resist? Let's go back to this. You can ponder that while I'm reading this. How could anyone resist the allure of the Pacific Northwest? Exquisite, unspoiled scenery, open space, employment opportunities, and a new life awaited away from the unknown and unhappy experiences of the congested East, the industrial East, and the Midwest. M.A. Matthews summed it up nicely in a 1904 article extolling the virtues of living in Seattle. He said, "To have the advantages of a great and growing city and at the same time to be in touch with nature is certainly ideal. There's nothing quite as inspiring as lofty mountain peaks and rolling ocean billows. To occupy a palatial home on an asphalt boulevard where one's children may watch the ebb and flow of the tide is a pleasure to be coveted. To live within a city that has within its corporate limits a chain of beautiful lakes, and beyond it, its corporate boundaries, manufacturing plants, truck farms, and forests is conducive to the development of children and the happiness of the parents. Seattle has all these advantages and many more that might be mentioned. Nature and art have agreed to live together in this city in perfect peace and harmony." Well, Matthews focused his attention on those who could afford palatial homes rather than on the vast majority of people who labored long hours in the manufacturing plants, the truck farms, and the forests to which he refers. Regardless, it was true that the urban growth and settlement patterns had in 50 years brought Seattle from infancy to maturity, making it a most satisfactory living environment with amenities that would have been the pride of other cities. Although physically located a great distance from major East and Midwest cities, by 1900, Seattle and Washington State were no longer isolated. The completion of mainline railways made it possible for people and products to move easily in and out of the Northwest, allowing the exchange of ideas as well as goods. Trunk lines reached out into the farms and the ranch lands, the timber and mining districts, and along the coast, as you can see in this map. West Coast steamship traffic linked California and the Orient with Seattle. And in response to the greater mobility offered with increasing popularity of the automobile, roads were built and improved. Interurban rail lines, along with modern streetcar systems, encouraged the building of homes some distance away from the downtown business centers of the large cities and towns. Our discussion today will showcase how this played out and shaped some fascinating communities. But first, I'm going to give you a little background, a little refresher course for most of you, and new information to others. Population growth in Seattle reflected national trends. During the period from 1900 to 1920, more houses were built in the United States than had been built during an entire previous history. In Seattle, growth had not come about without major engineering prowess that involved Herculean earth-moving projects and regrading in the central business district. In the hands of land developers whose imperative was opening up new tracts to home ownership, north, south, and east of downtown, it was only a matter of time before privately financed railways, cable cars, and streetcar lines laid their tracks along Yesler Way, Madison Street, James Street to Lake Washington, north along Lake Union to Ballard, Fremont, Latona, and Brooklyn, and south to Columbia City and Renton. With the successes of the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, a rival to its south, fresh on their minds, the city promoted its potential leadership in the Pacific Northwest and the Rim of Nations by mounting the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in 1909. Seattle's leading businessmen spent 4 years raising funds, securing commitments, engaging important architects and landscape professionals, and implementing a more ambitious undertaking than its Portland neighbors. The planning of the exhibition site, as well as the site planning and buildings for the state capitol in Olympia, are commonly recognized examples of the City Beautiful movement. Architects and city planners promoted physical order, design harmony, and symmetry during this era, laying the groundwork for attractive and workable cities. Virgil Bolg in 1911 did a Seattle plan that looked comprehensively at civic expression in architecture, at monumental avenues on axis to major government and transportation centers, and transportation and circulation improvements that would address city growth in the years to come. Of course, major plans of this nature were impressive, but they did not move the tax-paying public. Nevertheless, aspects of the plan lived on in its broader transportation and port recommendations and a group of distinctive, classically inspired civic, institutional, and commercial buildings. Planned communities were not a new concept in the Pacific Northwest. They had come naturally as an outgrowth of industry and the need to build workers' housing to support the shipbuilding, the coal mining, and lumber mills in the region. The Hall Brothers Shipyard and the Port Blakely Mill in Bainbridge Island were early examples, as was the Snoqualmie Falls Lumber Company east of Seattle. Most of the evidence of these early communities has disappeared. The earliest and certainly the most picturesque of them all was Port Gamble, developed by William Talbot and Andrew Pope in 1853 for their Puget Mill Company lumber operations. To entice workers from Maine to the far northwest frontier, they had buildings and the church designed and oriented to provide a familiar setting. That New England town character is preserved today. Much later, and on a grand city beautiful scale, was Longview in Southwest Washington. At the time of its conception, Longview was considered to be the only American planned city of its magnitude to have ever been conceived of and built entirely with private funds. And it was completely planned down to the sidewalks and the street names with private funds before the construction even began. The intent was to allow the city to grow along organized lines with separate areas designated for civic institution, business, industry, and residences. Robert Long, who was president of the Long Bell Lumber Company in Kansas City, had been seeking new resources, having depleted those in the South, and in 1918 made the decision to relocate. He purchased 14,000 acres in the Columbia River Valley, and given the need to bring thousands of workers into the area, made the decision to approach development comprehensively. Hare and Hare of Kansas City, who were nationally known city planners, were commissioned to develop the plan for a city of 75,000 people. The city was laid out beginning in 1923 with tree-lined boulevards, a lake, the Monticello Hotel, a library, City Hall, a movie theater, and attractive retail blocks. Long personally donated funds for the hotel, the high school, the YMCA, and the public library. While Longview was a unique case shaped from scratch, fortunately for developers and builders, towns and cities in Washington were ripe for development in the first quarter of the 20th century. Inexpensive lumber and land were available for purchase, and it made the region an ideal place for clapboard and shingle bungalow sales. First-time home buying and building in Washington reflected the population growth and job security of newcomers in an expanding economy. It also was tied to the domestic reforms that saw more women in the workplace and fewer servants in the home. The affordability of newly constructed homes was due to an increasing number of speculative developments opening up new neighborhoods, and the promotional offers of a large number of competing companies to entice those with enough money for a down payment to put down their roots with monthly costs that compared favorably with rents at the time. The greatest number of houses built in Seattle during this period were either straightforward American craftsmen or homes and bungalows in the style. In developing urban residential neighborhoods, bungalow real estate offices were typically designed to promote arts and crafts lifestyles. The September 1913 issue of Bungalow magazine featured an illustrated article on a bungalow office building located on California Avenue Southwest in West Seattle by architect W.R. Kelly. It served as office and showroom for the Fairmount Park addition in Seattle and was a proper clubhouse, distinguished by battered buttresses and heavy cornice, a brick gateway, pillars with half electric light fixtures led potential buyers into the brick and tile approach. And the paneled reception room had an oak floor, a Moravian tile fireplace around, and home emission furniture. And you can still visit this building, which is the CP Coffee Company. Enclaves of the well-to-do developed in locations that often took advantage of topography, water, and mountain views. Architects designed homes that cost many thousands of dollars, and they were constructed in Mount Baker, Queen Anne Hill, Capitol Hill. And stylistically, these houses ranged from Italian Renaissance to English Tudor, with an occasional Swiss chalet or a Spanish colonial mission. In just 20 years, between 1890 and 1910, Seattle's population exploded from 80,000 to nearly 250,000. People streamed away from downtown to fill these new residential areas on First Hill and Capitol Hill, some of the first streetcar suburbs. Capitol Hill's most prestigious early residential district was opened by pioneer developer James Moore, and his house is right at the front on the right-hand side. He came to Seattle in 1886 and became active in development and civic affairs throughout the Northwest. His Millionaires Row served as the gateway to Volunteer Park and also the site of his own house. Between 1902 and 1914, this section of 14th Avenue East was where many of Seattle's early business leaders built homes. At that time, the street had mountain and water views thanks to clear cutting. The larger middle-class community that surrounded it was composed mostly of Seattle classic box houses built during the same years, along with the small business district and religious institutions. John Charles Olmsted's Park and Boulevard plan, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, recommended that 14th Avenue East be a parkway. The property owners were given control of the street between Prospect and Roy. A median strip in the center was planted with shrubs, and each owner added the street trees. It became a showplace, attracting dignitaries and busloads of tourists en route to the park. And it was also the main route for funeral processions going through the park to Lakeview Cemetery, just north of the conservatory. To deter the stream of traffic, an ornate gateway was built at Roy Street. But by 1924, traffic had become so bad that the property owners petitioned the park department to take back control of the street. The gate and the median plantings were removed as a traffic hazard. Moore also developed large parts of Fremont, Wallingford, and the University Park area north of the University of Washington. The latter took advantage of Olmsted's transforming of 17th Avenue East into a chestnut-lined boulevard. The Olmsted legacy is tied to many of the Northwest's finest residential districts. In Seattle, Portland, Spokane, and smaller cities, the planning and actual development of parks and boulevards stimulated property development. John Charles Olmsted prepared reports for 3 major cities, Portland and Seattle in 1903, and Spokane in 1906. Where they were carried out, Olmsted's reports and recommendations embellished lakefronts, forests, hillsides, with driving routes of great beauty that encouraged the building of houses nearby. Of course, the true benefit to the cities that undertook these projects was the higher taxable value of the land which adjoined such amenities. Regardless, the resulting communities were distinguished and desirable. The Parks Department in Seattle immediately pursued purchase of land to allow what would become, despite major missing links, one of the largest Olmsted-designed park and boulevard systems in the nation. Seattle's hilly topography, its forested slopes, Lake Washington, and views of Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, and both the Cascade and Olympic Range made it a challenging but exciting opportunity for the Olmsted brothers. Many of these neighborhoods, such as James Moore's north of Capitol Hill and University Park, were planned developments in which the owner of the tract developed and platted the property into blocks and lots for sale. Generally, they were laid out in typical rectangular grids, though in the cases where topography presented challenges, they might defer to the idiosyncrasies of the land, even taking those clues as an advantage. Occasionally, the concerted effort of the development company to work with other city agencies resulted in neighborhoods that espoused the city beautiful ideal. One such example was Mount Baker Park. The area has an outstanding mix of architect-designed residences, builder-designed speculative homes, and bungalows that make it a classroom for learning about residential styles. Its streets follow hillside contours and offer wonderful views of Lake Washington and the Cascades. The Mount Baker neighborhood encompassed a number of separate land tracts, and of these, the Mount Baker Park addition, platted in 1907 by the Hunter Tract Improvement Company, provided the neighborhood with its name and its identity. While not the earliest planned residential district in Seattle, it was the largest at the time and one of the first to be integrated into the city park and boulevard system. From the layout and planning of the Mount Baker Park addition, the Hunter Tract Improvement Company initially considered the Olmsted Brothers in 1906, but eventually opted for local civic engineer George Cotterill of the firm of Cotterill and Whitworth, assisted by another local civic engineering firm, the Sawyer Brothers. The landscaping work was accomplished under the able direction of Edward Schwagerl. Cotterill was familiar with with Olmsted's planned work because he had done the survey work to lay out the AYP exposition grounds to plans by the Olmsteds, and Schwagerl was even more familiar with the work of the Board of Park Commissioners and the famous 1903 Olmsted Plan, inasmuch as he had served as superintendent of public parks, and he did that from 1892 to 1895. He'd also laid out Kinnear and Denny parks, and had been an early proponent of an integrated park and boulevards plan for the city. The Tract Improvement Company sought to create an exclusive upper-income residential district, and in addition to its planning of the subdivision and the generous inclusion of public parkland, the principal means of achieving this goal was through deed restrictions. They included no more than one building per lot, houses to be erected in established building lines, no residence to cost less than $2,000 to $5,000, depending on the location within the district, and every house has to contain a basement, no outhouses or stables, no animals except domestic pets, and only one commercial building to be allowed. The Mount Baker Park Improvement Club was organized in 1909 to promote the physical development of Mount Baker Park, the beautification of the park as a whole, and to also encourage homeowners to personal effort to develop and improve their property, and also to organize and aid various neighborhood clubs which may benefit from the community by social, cultural, educational, and charitable work. The neighborhood was to be centered around the arts and crafts design Mount Baker Clubhouse, and by a signature commercial building of similar design, which, due to lack of funds, didn't get built until 1930, and thus it became an Art Deco building by John Graham rather than an arts and crafts building. But the vision of its developers, the vigilance of its community activists, shaped a remarkably cohesive residential district. Quality and character of individual homes owe much to local architects. In some ways, it seems strange that a city like Seattle, which in 1903 was only 52 years old, would be questioning the value of urban life, having set a goal of growth, expansion, and promotion. But that year, an article in the Seattle Mail and Herald proposing, quote, an interurban colony adjacent to the newly developing electric commuter line, expressed some of the challenges that urban life had brought and that had begun to have an impact upon family life. The conclusions about the future of the inner city as the middle class fled for suburban and rural homes were remarkably accurate in their predictions. And I'm quoting here. A movement is on foot to establish a colony of country dwellers from the city somewhere along the line of the interurban electric car line between this city and Everett. It is thought by those initiating the movement that there will be no difficulty experienced about getting people to join in such an enterprise. The desire for country residence is getting stronger in the minds of city people each year. The possibilities for a pleasant home life are far greater in the country than in the city. In fact, the home life gets very little consideration at the hands of the average businessman. From morning until evening, he is at the office or the store. In the evening, it's either the club or the lodge or the theater or some business or political conference that takes him downtown again. The city man who can get his home located far enough out in the country will spend more of his evenings at home. Then too, the opportunity to have larger grounds give more freedom and room for beautifying by means of flowers and shrubs and orchards. This colony project is a good idea. Along the line of such transportation as people can get to and from their homes in as short a time as can be made by those who live in the suburbs and have to ride on those slow-going trolley cars. With the possibilities of such transportation through the country, it is only a question of time when the better class of the population of the cities will all live in the country, and only the ultra-poor and the criminal classes will live in the city. There is so much more health and beauty and freedom and good living in the country. It surely is the place to enjoy life. Of course, people of a certain class didn't need to wait for the interurban, as they were the early purchasers of automobiles. They also had chauffeurs at their disposal. In Seattle, the summer castles were beginning to take shape in 1909 in a pristine forest several miles north of city limits, the Highlands. Kirtland Cutter's chalet-style golf club was the stage that set for a variety of impressive country retreats, ranging from modest arts and crafts cottages, such as the first residence on the Bluff property owned by lumberman C.D. Stimson, to more substantial year-round mansions. The old Seattle Golf Club had been located in Laurelhurst, and it was feeling the pressure of real estate developers. It had never been a large course with only 9 holes, and access to it was commonly by boat. A new site was needed to accommodate an 18-hole course that would be suitable for its members. A specially appointed committee at the club examined on foot and horseback all available tracts of land from Three Tree Point north as far as Richmond Beach before it decided on a 380-acre tract of undeveloped land on a bluff overlooking Puget Sound, 3 miles north of 85th Street, which was at that time the city limits. Part of the tract was sculpted by John Ball into the new Seattle Golf Club, and the remainder was sold as residential lots to club members. The Highlands would offer breathing space, privacy, and recreation within a short commute of the central business district. C.T. Stimson made the first step. He either purchased outright or arranged for options on the land. Records show that at one time the entire tract, now known as the Highlands, was in his name. Articles of incorporation were drawn up and the Highlands Charter was signed in April of 1908. C.D. Stimson was elected president and continued in that role for 11 years. While an exclusive community bordering a golf course seems commonplace now, in 1908, this breadth of vision was unusual. It proposed master planning of a residential community that would preserve native growth forest by restricting where buildings could take place. In most cases, houses could not be seen from the roads, and they were developed with an appreciation of and a great respect for the hilly, undulating topography of the land. Views of Puget Sound were an important attraction of the properties, but many of the plats lacked views, and their homes were set in landscaped clearings within the Northwest Forest. The later additions of a chapel and a school, courtesy of Horace Henry and C.D. Stimson, turned the housing development into a more cohesive community. It was the perfect marriage of wealth, power, and design skills. The first survey and topographical map of the tract was made by A.S. Downey, a civil engineer. The Highlands Board gave the map to the Olmsted Brothers with the instructions to lay out roads and plat residential tracts and park areas. Ultimately, the Olmsted firm received a large number of commissions from individual tract owners to do the site planning, garden design, and even to design outbuildings and pavilions. By the way, the photograph on the right is the earlier house by the C.D. Stimson family, designed by Cutter for them before they moved into the big house. Choice of residential tracts was determined by lottery. Judge Thomas Burke drew tract number 1, which was the most desirable view property. But it didn't take long before C.D. Stimson maneuvered a trade. His property had been drawn nearer the golf course. So he got the bluff property where he had that arts and crafts cabin built, and then choice lots were soon sites of traditional Tudor, colonial, Georgian, prairie style retreats for the city's influential mercantile and industrialists. Architects of nationwide influence were imported, such as Charles Platt of New York. Prominent local architects such as John Graham Sr., Charles Bebb, Carl Gould, Kirkland Cutter, Andrew Willitson, Arthur Lovelace, and A.H. Albertson were all well represented. In some cases, such as Willitson's progressive prairie home for the Carey family, only a small portion was completed. It was only fitting that C.D. Stimson, having masterminded the project, secured the choicest bluff property for himself and his children. And Kirkland Cutter, who designed Stimson's first hill house, his mill company building in Ballard, and the Rainier Club, and having been hired, probably through Stimson's efforts to design the new clubhouse, was also the obvious choice for Stimson's most ambitious private residence, Norcliffe. At 20,000 square feet, it was twice the size of his in-city home and included a ground floor ballroom for entertaining a crowd. It was truly the epitome of living the good life. The Olmsteds had also designed the landscaping for Mrs. Stimson, who was not quite satisfied with it, and she changed it. Other Seattleites, anxious for occasional getaways or for their own private country retreats, found them a boat away. Commuting ferries served islanders and shoreline communities for much of the early 20th century. They made it practical to reach the golf course at Restoration Point on Bainbridge Island and South Sound developments such as Three Tree Point. The southeast jut of Bainbridge Island was the anchorage for Captain George Vancouver's two vessels, the Discovery and the Chatham, in the spring of 1792, and where he went away and ashore to meet the native population. Named by him Restoration Point to honor the return of the Stuarts to the English throne in the 1850s, this area of Bainbridge had been known as Bean's Point, named for Reuben Bean, whose claim extended west of the point where Fort Ward was built. Eric Gustav Saunders owned the property from 1868. According to Tom Pelly, who was son of a founding member of the country club, the club was the brainstorm of several young Seattle boating enthusiasts who looked at the protected anchorage as an inviting spot for summer weekends. He relates, out of the heterogeneous many who came to the growing town of Seattle during the 80s were a few younger men who formed an unusually congenial clique. These men were drawn together by many ties, not the least of which was their mutual affection and fondness for sports. Sailing was a favorite recreation, and various members of the group, together or individually, rarely were without a boat of some sort. In 1888, they proposed purchasing land and erecting a cabin for overnights. They postponed their plan until 1891, when they purchased 5.5 acres from Gus Sanders for $1,000. Sanders built them a clubhouse on the tip of the point, which has survived today. The first official meeting of the club's 15 members was held in May of 1891. As members' families expanded, so did the club's property, offering opportunities for family cabins that were enlarged or replaced over the years with handsome homes designed by local architects such as Carl Gould, who maintained his own family summer retreat adjoining the club. Along with the houses came tennis courts, a swimming pool, stables. Apparently riding was a major club pastime, and practically every family had at least one horse. And it had the first golf course in the vicinity of Seattle. The first tournament was held there in June of 1896, and it was enlarged to 9 holes by 1915. In June 1903, the Westerner carried an advertisement for, quote, Three Tree Point, a summer resort, Three Tree Point Company, 625 First Avenue, C.B. Livermore, manager. 267 acres with beaches extending 5 miles, dock, natural park, selling lots. Not coincidentally, a later issue in May 1905 carried an enticing story about Three Tree Point, a place of summer homes close to the throbbing heart of the great Northwest metropolis. While highways connected inland areas, the Puget Sound Mosquito fleet of small steamships served the beach communities of Des Moines, Three Tree Point, and Crescent Beach, with connections to Seattle, Tacoma, and Olympia. Puget Sound Indians had used what is today called Three Tree Point as a summer camp, a trading area, and a hunting ground. Early settlers recalled canoes pulled up to the sand and fishes drying on racks on the beach. During the 1890s, many of Seattle's wealthy families likewise began to want summer camps away from the city, and real estate developers explored beach communities with beautiful views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains in their sights. In 1895, the Schwabacher brothers, a longtime Seattle merchants, and Bailey Gatzert, who was at one point the mayor of Seattle, bought land at Three Tree Point, which was called Point Pulley on navigation charts. James Lohman, Bernard Pelly, who served as a Great Britain's vice consul in Seattle, and Charles Livermore, all Seattle businessmen associated with Lohman and Hanford Printing Company, and its successors, formed the Three Tree Point Company. They bought 267 acres with 2.5 miles of waterfront at the point in 1902 and began formal development of a summer resort. Opening in July 1903, the private resort offered accommodations for picnicking, camping, and hunting along the waterfront, accessed by steamer from Seattle and Tacoma. Summer home sites were also made available. The first of the summer homes was built by Lyndon Irwin Gregory in 1902, and many followed after. For a decade or more, Seattleites and Tacomans relied on steamship service to reach this lovely spot. No road was built to connect the point with Lake Burien area until 1915. In February 1917, Bungalow magazine mentioned a $4,600 bungalow in Lake Forest Park, north of Seattle. It explained that the linking of the lakes had created, quote, scores of miles of shoreland on Lake Washington with completion of the canal, responsible for opening up of Lake Forest Park, a new suburban residential section. Dozens of beautiful bungalows were built there by enterprising owners while the work of digging the Great Canal was in progress. The focus of the article was the house of Mr. A.H. Reed, designed by architect W.C. Jackson. It said, "Not only is this fine home accessible direct by watercraft, but it may also be reached by a fine state highway and by an electric interurban streetcar line." Lake Forest Park was one of the first planned communities in King County. From its inception in 1909, the community paid great attention to its natural surroundings to create a marriage of residential dwelling and wooded terrain. It was situated on land that was once a winter village site for the Snohomish tribe. In the late 1800s, early white pioneers encountered a small group of houses still used by tribal members. Indians inhabited this small village as late as 1903, by which time the influx of loggers and settlers disrupted the Indians and caused them to move elsewhere. Most of the first landowners in the 1860s took up plats only to sell them to sawmill companies within a fairly short time. But by the 1880s, other pioneers preferred to log the cedars and dug fir and to improve the land themselves or with the help of a small crew. Small logging operations were common, but loggers usually harvested only the larger trees near the lake shore. At first, the lake was the easiest way to get to and from Seattle, 10 miles away. In 1879, the Military Road, a muddy set of ruts that eventually became Bothell Way, was cleared and graded. In 1888, the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railway was built around the lake, which created another connection to the big city. By the turn of the century, logging operations were in full swing. A small logging railway was built that parallels present-day Ballinger Way. And by 1910, most of the old-growth forest had been cut down, opening the way for residential development. Ole Hansen, along with his wife's nephew, A.H. Reed, the owner of that bungalow, incorporated the North Seattle Improvement Company in 1909 with an eye for the future. He saw the real estate potential in the outlying area and started buying up land. He hired civil engineer B.E. Corlett to create the plat of what became Lake Forest Park. It was laid out along the contours of the hillside. The pristine topography and the remaining trees received prime consideration, determining lot size and location. Even the name Lake Forest Park stressed the three rustic elements of the new community. By 1912, Hansen created a handsome promotional brochure calling attention to the benefits of buying a home in Lake Forest Park. Quote, "Here the laughing waters will forever make gladsome the heart of the sylvan dwellers." He interspersed this booklet with photos by the noted photographer Aschel Curtis. Hansen did not want his community to be a playground for the rich. Anyone who could buy a lot was free to build a home, as long as it wasn't a saloon, a store, a roadhouse, or an apartment house. This was a residential park, especially for people who had cars. Paving the road from Seattle had already begun. The promotion was a success. Further promotions, such as large ads in the Seattle papers and articles in national magazines, opened the door for Hansen's company to annex surrounding land for more home builders. And the homes built during this period, some still in existence, ranged from quaint bungalows to large colonial or Tudor revival style houses. And just as Hansen had hoped, the design of each home was individual and picturesque. Hansen had rebuilt houses in the park, but they only stayed a few years. They later took on the development of San Clemente in Southern California, but not before Ole Hansen became Seattle's union-busting mayor during the Seattle General Strike of 1919. After that, he briefly became a candidate at the Republican National Convention, running a campaign based mostly on squelching socialists and baiting Reds. The folks back in Lake Forest Park were happy just to build a home within the harmony of nature. In the 1920s, more than 100 new homes were built in the park. The roads were improved, gas was cheaper, and more families saw the community as a way of escaping the hubbub of the city. In 1923, a school was built. The following year, a civic club was formed. Small businesses like grocery stores and gas stations began popping up nearby. Following World War II, some of this idyllic lifestyle would change. The 1950s brought an explosion of suburban growth to the entire nation, and Lake Forest Park was no different. Seattle's northern boundary had been pushed further north, causing apartments and commercial properties to encroach upon the community. Bothell Way through Kenmore was nicknamed Crisco Way for the fried food eateries lining its strip. And by the end of the 1950s, a large shopping center was planned near the foot of Ballinger Way. In 1961, citizens banded together and incorporated the city of Lake Forest Park. Let's look now at a latecomer to controlled development north of Seattle, Woodway Park. The romantic nature of Woodway Park, which was a distinctive and protected residential development, was expressed in the handsome publicity brochure that they produced in 1930 after some of its more significant homes had been built, and I'll read it to you. In Woodway Park, nature quietly toils, producing in towering fir and cedar, in dogwood and salal, and in orchard and garden and lawn, the ideal setting for happy home life. Along Puget Sound, facing the snow-capped Olympics, on the northern border of the future city limits of Seattle, is this peaceful colony of ideal suburban homes. Founder David Whitcomb had come to Seattle from Amherst, Massachusetts, to oversee downtown properties owned by his father, properties that eventually included the Arcade Building and the Rhodes Department Store Building, both of which are now the site of the Seattle Art Museum downtown. Whitman was drawn to 320 acres south of Edmonds that had recently been logged by A.M. Yost, and still visible were the bent tree markings that marked the Indian trails to Snoqualmie Falls from the waterfront. With his two brothers, Whitcomb purchased the land in 1913 for $90,000 and established Woodway Park. His vision was a woodland residential community with easy access to the city along Pacific Highway. The sales of lots came with setback requirements, prohibition on subdividing lots to less than 2 acres, and prohibition on building more than one home on each 2-acre lot. The intent was to maintain breathing space and the country-like atmosphere in perpetuity, preventing that kind of development that inevitably destroyed the peacefulness of city homes. Whitcomb took advantage of his ownership of the entire park by selecting a prime bluff site for the largest estate, his. He had the Brown Owl Lodge built on the property and lived there until Westwold, a sandstone English home, was completed in 1927. His property, Whitcomb Farms, had orchards, horses, cattle, goats, as well as a saltwater swimming pool, garages, a private airport, and a polo ground. Other property owners from various parts of the country followed suit, building large homes on the bluff property during the 20s and 30s, with the help of some of Seattle's finest residential designers, who included Edwin Ivey, William Bain and Lionel Preece, W.H. Whiteley, Arthur Lovelace, George Stoddard, Thomas Granger and Thomas, and David Myers. And among these transplants were people from Minneapolis, New York State, Tennessee, Texas, Mississippi, Minnesota, and Michigan, and California. So quite the range. Woodway residents were alarmed in 1957 by a proposal to include Woodway in a proposed annexation to Edmonds. Seeing that as a threat to the lifestyle of the area, residents within 3 days had filed a petition with the county auditor's office calling for an election to incorporate as a fourth-class city. In a special election in 1958, the town of Woodway was approved. Most of the communities I've talked about this far were established specifically for home ownership, social and cultural connections, and in some cases, exclusivity. But there was another type of community that arose regionally, espousing utopian ideals. Elbert Hubbard's Roycroft and others like Birdcliff and Rose Valley were all located in the Northeast, and they were well publicized and known across the country. The far West, with its distance from the traditions and restrictions of the East Coast, was very receptive to ideal and idyllic communities founded on principles of art, utility, comfort, self-sufficiency, and shared values. Hubbard promoted these in his publications, issuing forth from his Roycroft publishing house. The circulation of the Fra, the Philistine, Little Journeys was a nationwide phenomenon. His Roycroft community in East Aurora, New York, which was founded in 1897, had become the talk of the nation by the first part of the 20th century, and Hubbard traveled throughout America, including the Northwest, on lecture circuits. As early as 1904, he made a stopover in Spokane and was so impressed with its people and architecture that when he returned to East Aurora, he wrote in his Philistine that Spokane was the model city of America. Hubbard was asked to give a lecture at Home, Washington in 1904. While a number of utopian community experiments flourished in the South Sound, including the Puget Sound Cooperative Colony, Equity, and Burley, Home was really considered to be the most radical of the group, having a reputation for anarchism, the liberal home press, and stories about free love and nude bathing. The individualism of the local residents and famous visitors fascinated later journalists and historians. Founded on principles of tolerance and independence, the community grew to 120 residents by 1905. Among the settlers was Richard Bowl, who came to Home from Elbert Hubbard's Roycroft community. James Morton, a chief spokesman for Home, commented that there was probably more in common between Home and the Roycroft community than between either of the other two and any other settlement in the world. Morton and another Hubbard admirer, L.E. Redder from Olalla, enticed Hubbard to speak in Home after hearing him lecture in Tacoma. He spent time at the colony, won over his audience with his charisma, and shared his belief in the need for bringing beauty into the world by doing for others. Hubbard praised, quote, his day with the most peculiar community I have ever seen, anarchists. While that was perhaps a gesture of support, rather than an actual intent, Hubbard had thought about opening a branch out there. Hubbard was probably an inspiration to the founders and editors of the Burley Colony's Soundview magazine, which they called a magazinelet devoted to the obstetrics of thought and the philosophy of existence. This monthly of about 36 pages was conceived as the Western counterpart to Elbert Hubbard's Philistine. While there is no direct evidence to suggest it, the formation of the Beaux Arts Society and Workshop by Frank Calvert and Alfred Renfro in 1908 nicely coincided with Elbert Hubbard's visits to the Northwest. It also may not be a coincidence that the British designer C.R. Ashby visited Seattle in 1909, and his public lectures while there would have drawn an audience from the newly formed Beaux Arts Society. And he certainly would have visited those with interest that he shared before leaving for Oregon, California. Ashby's Guild of Handicraft Workshop at Chipping Camden may have been visionary for Calvert and Renfro. However, it was more likely that Elbert Hubbard's well-promoted Roycroft community and its arts and crafts workshops served as models for the two of them as they proceeded to develop a 50-acre forested work and living space on the east shores of Lake Washington, as they said, where art workers could live, work, and play together. The emblem of the Beaux Arts Society was the Bozart Cottage, an arts and crafts bungalow designed along Swiss chalet lines and constructed partly of logs. According to the founders, it was a refinement of the pioneer cabin of the West and emblematic of home. The plan of the Beaux Arts Village, as you can see, shows that the workshop or the atelier was the centerpiece of the grounds, which were laid out in the residential neighborhood. During this period, craftsman homes on half-acre lots began to rise in the woodland setting, with 1,000 feet of waterfront dedicated to a community park. Plans were prepared for art studios, workshops, woodworking, sculpture, engraving, wrought iron, any other art activities the members wanted to explore. However, Calvert and Renfro both built rustic wooden chalets. Other members followed suit. And in 1913, Bungalow magazine carried 2 articles about the village and its housing and spoke about this fine example of Swiss chalet type, but without elaborate ornamentation, which is too often copied without regard to merit or proper association. Unfortunately, Beaux Arts Village soon lost its focus and its artists commuted by ferry to Seattle for their 8-to-5 jobs, and the community center, the workshops, remained unbuilt. The dream altered quickly once the ideals of bohemian life were tested against the realities of daily life and making a living. Coming full circle then, we return to the major force in Seattle in settling and developing the Pacific Northwest, the lumber companies. The largest and most influential in terms of planned communities was the Puget Mill Company, with huge tracts of land at its disposal. The company's holdings in the Puget Sound region included about 200 acres of land immediately adjoining Washington Park, now the Washington Arboretum, which had developed into an exclusive upper-class gated community and golf course, which is, of course, you know as Broadmoor. Its target was Seattle's pioneering and most successful business names, as can be seen from this hand-addressed invitation to Mrs. Morgan Carkeek of First Hill to encourage a site visit. The 1920s promotional brochure claims, quote, "There are families to whom golf is nothing short of a necessity. For such people, Broadmoor is the inevitable choice, just as it has been the choice of over 300 of Seattle's leading citizens." Well, the Puget Mill Company holdings included other tracts, neighborhoods called Homecraft and Cottage Grove in West Seattle, Beacon Hill, Sheridan Beach along Lake Washington, and north of incorporated Seattle, they took advantage of the new Seattle to Everett and interurban railway for planned communities like Avondale, Shelby, Inglewood, Cedar Park, and Lakewood Villa. But the showpiece was Alderwood Manor. It was located halfway between Seattle and Everett. Altruistically, it could be thought of as an effort to develop a sustainable community in 1917 with the same spirit as early utopian communities on Puget Sound. A dairy farm was at its core. As part of the promotion for Alderwood Manor, a demonstration farm was created to illustrate the community lifestyle. And in this 30-acre site, potential residents learned how to raise chickens, farm fish, grow vegetables and fruit. And soon after it opened, Alderwood Manor became one of the largest egg producers in the country. In reality, this project was an attempt to reduce the company's tax obligation for its logged land by turning it to real estate. Go back. With the completion of the nearby Highway 99 in 1927, the community grew much larger. It, however, suffered greatly during the Depression when the price of eggs fell, and many of the residents were forced to sell their land, and the demonstration farm was closed. In addition, the crucial interurban railway ceased to operate in 1939. In the 1960s, after Interstate 5 was constructed, Alderwood Manor was incorporated as a city. The effort failed, however, and Alderwood Manor town became part of the city of Linwood. So I'd like to close by offering up Seabrook, which is a privately developed coastal new town that followed principles of new urbanism and green building on its bluff property on the west coast of the Olympic Peninsula. It is a mix of permanent and residential and resort housing, retail, and public amenities. The hallmarks of Seabrook are a comprehensive master plan that protects land and seascapes, defines residential and commercial zones, and lays out design guidelines for its buildings to create harmonious streetscapes. Growth has been carefully phased to respond to demand for its properties. I've laid out numerous early day and more recent efforts to develop sustainable communities to accommodate urban and suburban growth and to showcase for you the various approaches motivated by altruism, idealism, arts, golf, and profiteering. With all these examples in hand, I hope you will take the opportunity to consider what we might learn from them. Unless you're Rip Van Winkle, thank you, you can't help but be aware of the increasingly vocal discussions about upzoning our traditional single-family residences and neighborhoods, its potential for devaluing existing housing. There are certain developers and architects who understand the importance of scale and materials, of fitting new construction in with the older residential fabric, and of valuing traditional neighborhood business districts. And there also are developers who are only seeing the potential in higher density and contemporary design and taking advantage of every possible method to maximize a building lot. I hope that you will bring your thoughts and opinions to the fore and become advocates for preserving and maintaining the viable communities that have encouraged you to settle here. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.